For as long as America has been a country, we have been supportive of some truly reprehensible world leaders. And you've probably heard many times throughout your life that we get involved with some of these countries despite proclaiming that what we are pushing for is more democracy across the world. So, what exactly is causing that disconnect, and what forms does it take at present? We are joined by David Swanson, Executive Director of World Beyond War and the author of 20 Dictators the U.S. Currently Supports. David, welcome to the Damage Report.
Hi, John. Good to be here.
Very glad to have you on. Excited, honestly, in these days to talk about anything that doesn't have to do with the worldwide spread of disease. And you've got a book that came out quite recently, actually. Can you tell me a little bit about what led to you wanting to write this analysis of the current dictators that we're supportive of?
Well, I'm not a big fan of war lies, and whenever there's a need for a new war or a coup in Venezuela or overthrowing the government of Syria or blaming a horrible election on Russia, we hear about foreign dictators. And when Donald Trump meets with a dictator in North Korea, or Bernie Sanders says something that's not 100% negative about a ruler in Cuba, we hear dictator, dictator, dictator. And so I wanted to look at, because it occurred to me that the usual pattern with dictators for the U.S. government was to arm them and train them and fund them. So I wanted to look in some detail. Was that really the case? Or was the U.S. government actually maintaining a distance from some dictators so that this outrage about North Korea or Cuba actually made sense?
So, in the book, you talk about 20. So, just to be clear, is that an all-encompassing list, or are these 20 sort of emblematic cases that you're talking about? But arguably, you could have included others?
Well, a lot of the studies that are done are that rank governments in terms of their brutality and their oppression and their violation of human rights don't distinguish dictatorships from other forms of government. So, in fact, I looked at a list of 50 oppressive governments and looked at how the U.S. government dealt with them and found that 82% of them, the U.S. government arms them, 88% it trains their militaries, 64% it funds their militaries. It supports in some way 96% of them. And then I narrowed it down to 20 that could be called dictatorships because they're really dominated by a single individual. And it's not science. You could argue reasonably that there were a few more I should have counted as dictatorships, or there were a couple I shouldn't have counted as dictatorships. But these are 20 that are pretty solidly dictatorships and clearly supported by the U.S. government.
And what are some of the countries that have made your list?
Well, without giving the whole list, so maybe a couple people buy the book.
That's the goal.
I think you can start through the alphabet, right? The King of Bahrain, the Sultan of Brunei, the president, so-called, of Egypt, but who has declared emergency powers over and over, giving himself the role of dictator. These are people who, if wars were really motivated by the desire to attack dictators, these guys, all 20 of them would make wonderful propaganda. I mean, the hideousness of their crimes, their endless lists of political prisoners and torture victims, and the outrageousness of their excessive wealth, and the incredible waste and consumption by these people and their families would just make beautiful propaganda if the U.S. military were interested, as it may be someday, in attacking some of these countries.
So, you talk about around the book that it'll be extremely difficult for someone to read the book and still believe that one of the principal causes of intervention by the U.S. in other countries is actually what they say it is, which is to promote democracy. So tell me a little bit about that, because I'm curious, do you believe that in some cases there are people in government that actually do believe that is a goal, or is that always a cover? Is it just convenient, or are they falling short of an actual mission that they have? I'm curious what you think what you think is underlying all of that.
Well, a government like the U.S. government has many thousands of people in it who believe all variety of things, and many go into governments with the best intentions, which is how some of them become whistleblowers and how some of them do some good from within a government. But if you look at the U.S. relationship to dictatorships, almost all of them, the U.S. government funds and arms and trains their militaries. This is not some, few bad apples carefully selected by me. This is the rule. I mean, the only exceptions are the designated enemies, the North Koreas, the Irans, etc. So to think that the wars are actually motivated by a desire to attack dictatorships is absurd. And almost every dictatorship that has been attacked in a U.S. war was previously supported, if not empowered, if not put in place by the U.S. government. And if you look at where wars happen, there are factors that do correlate with where wars happen, including the presence of fossil fuels, but not the presence of dictatorship. I mean, the U.S. is partnering in a war right now that hasn't stopped with one of the most brutal dictatorships on earth, Saudi Arabia, and several others, in bombing the people of Yemen. So it's almost the opposite. I mean, a number of these dictatorships in this list of 20, in fact, host U.S. military bases and sell the U.S. oil and are otherwise allies of the United States. So this is not, they're not somehow future targets waiting because the United States hates dictatorships.
Yeah. And you talked about some of the ways that we're supportive of them, not just in terms of rhetoric, but actual like financial and military support, which obviously can be a lot of money. I'm curious, as an anti-war advocate, how do you think that we and potentially viewers could get involved in trying to put pressure on cutting ties with some of these horrible regimes?
Well, universities across the United States are funded by brutal dictatorships, kingdoms from the Middle East and Asia, and shouldn't be. And we should divest those institutions from that money. So-called progressive think tanks like the Center for American Progress, the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, and dozens of others, funded by dictators like that of the United Arab Emirates. There ought to be shame involved in these relationships. And there's actually legislation introduced by Congresswoman Ilhan Omar in the U.S. Congress, House Resolution 5880, called the Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers Act, which simply says stop selling weapons to the worst human rights abusers. Now, as an anti-war activist, I find it a little absurd because I don't know how you used weapons of war without violating human rights. But nonetheless, I think passing this bill would be a huge step forward.
You mention in the description of the book, by the way, that there's one thing that ties together many of these dictators is what you term glorious goofiness. Can you give us an example of what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, these are people who you've seen posters of some of their possessions with mottos like "He who dies with the most toys wins." I mean, these are people with thousands of specialized automobiles, rotting away in their collections. People like the president of Tajikistan, who John Oliver did a whole 20-minute video making fun of him, of how he'll, enter a car race and they'll make sure he quote unquote wins. Entered a horse race and he just about won, but did a face plant, and yet not one word from John Oliver about the fact that the U.S. military is arming and training and funding his military. That's what I want to enter into U.S. discourse. But yeah, if these people were targets of propaganda, if they were the next place for a coup or sanctions or a war, the material is just extremely rich.
I'm curious, too, about the different forms that support for these dictators can come in, because, many of the cases that you talk about in your book, these are not new relationships. There are some that go back, many, many decades. So Donald Trump, obviously, in terms of a sort of like personal relationship with dictators, seems to have gone above and beyond in terms of the fondness he expresses for them and that sort of thing. past rulers don't necessarily write letters to these dictators, but give billions of dollars, to their militaries. Do you believe that Trump's form of support for dictators, in the more sort of personal friendship, does that matter in any way? Or is it just surface on something that's been a problem, a very similar problem for a long time?
I think it matters. I think it's reprehensible. I think it's dangerous. I think it's impeachable. I think it's also important that we know that it's not completely brand new, that, not only are dictatorships doing business with Trump's businesses, but dictatorships were giving huge donations to the Clinton Foundation, which the Secretary of State Clinton was then waiving bans on selling weapons to those dictatorships. So the personal interests of politicians in D.C. Is one factor, like the corporate media, like the funding of universities and think tanks and so on, that creates this situation. But to have a U.S. president talking like a dictator, clearly wanting to be a dictator, admiring foreign dictators openly, I have a problem with that. I have a problem with a lot of things Donald Trump does.
Well, we certainly share that. The book is 20 Dictators Currently Supported by the U.S., and you did a great job of not giving too many details on them. I'm sure there's a lot more. How exactly did you determine a glorious goofiness in there? So everyone is going to want to definitely take a look at that. And David, we really appreciate you joining us on the show today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.